Okay, welcome to the REBT Advocates. I believe it's our 60th podcast. And again, we have the pleasure of having the renowned Debbie Jaffe Ellis on with us, who's been a speaker, writer, and clinician for REBT, and a great one at that. And I'm Michael Edelstein. I'm a clinical psychologist at 3minutetherapy.com. My usual partner, Tommy Bateman, is on the road, so he won't be joining us. So Debbie and I will be doing it on our own. And today we wanted to discuss some controversial topics in REBT. Debbie and I and most of my REBT colleagues, agree on 99.9% of the theory and the practice, but being individuals, we come up with some differences. So Debbie and I would like to discuss our differences. So the first one we could discuss is anger. And it's my impression, Debbie, that you divide anger into appropriate anger and inappropriate anger. Is that correct?
Not appropriate or inappropriate. I guess I describe them as healthy, perhaps you could say appropriate, versus unhealthy, which for me equals rage, equals destructive, equals potentially harmful, and certainly not helpful. The healthy anger I consider potentially constructive, or at the very least does no harm.
Okay, very good, very good. And many therapists see anger that way, healthy and unhealthy. And I have a different view, and my view is based on my interpretation of REBT, which is based on my interpretation of what Albert Ellis says, because he originally devised REBT in the 1950s, from which all cognitive therapies were spawned. And so if I want to know what REBT is, if I'm unsure, I go to Albert Ellis, I go to his writings or his talks, many of which you can find on YouTube. And he's written over 80 books, so there's plenty there to inform you. And so my interpretation is that all anger is unhealthy, inappropriate, unhelpful. And there are many reasons, but the fundamental reason is all anger comes from demands. Must, should, supposed to's. You should treat me fairly, kindly, considerately, lovingly, courteously, reciprocally, understandingly. And if you don't, you're no good, you're a rotten person, you deserve to roast in hell, and I've appointed myself your roaster. And that tends to alienate people, lead you to feel bad, and there are some medical problems coming from that at times, high blood pressure and other things. So, and then Debbie, what you're calling healthy anger, I call assertiveness, passion, determination, speaking your mind, and comes from preferences or passionate, strong preferences, such as I prefer you treat me well and treat me kindly and fairly. And if you don't, there are disadvantages. And from my perspective, you're acting poorly, you're acting badly, but that doesn't overgeneralize to you as a bad person. So that's how I look at it. Did you want to respond to that, Debbie?
Sure. Thanks, Michael. Yeah, I love to. As I'm listening to you, I think a large contributor to what might be maybe foggy or unclear understanding of where each of us is coming from is how we define the word anger. And even though you invite me to describe my idea of the difference between healthy, appropriate, or unhealthy, inappropriate anger, we still might have a slightly different idea or belief about the definition of anger. So when I first heard what you said, it's starting to talk about anger, you start by saying something, I jotted it down, and correct me if I'm mistaken, but that you believe all anger comes from demands should. So when I hear all, my little overgeneralization alarm comes up. And so prove to me that all anger comes from demands, if you can, would be my question to you. And so again, with my understanding of the meaning of anger in the context we're discussing, I don't believe that all anger necessarily comes from demands or shoulds or musts. Here's where I'm coming from, if you'd like me to keep speaking on it now.
Certainly, yes.
Yeah. So REBT, according to Albert Ellis, which is the REBT you and I embrace, and of course do our best to make it relevant for the here and now, but at its core, it's humanistic. And there seems to be an implicit belief therein that if a human being is not disturbed in any significant way, either cognitively, biochemically, physically, if a human being is able to think relatively clearly and in an undistorted way, if the person is able to think about their thinking and have the capacity to be objective, somewhat of a metacognition, then with this understanding, and again, you'll disagree with me if you do, that at its core, REBT is humanistic. There is a leaning in such healthy thinking, feeling, being people to do no harm, to act in as much as humanly possible for the fallible humans each of us is or are, whatever the tense is, that we don't intentionally do harm, that as best as we can, we choose a moral way, an ethical way. So with that premise, which may not apply to all circumstances in life, but I think it can apply to many in which a person can make themselves angry, healthily or unhealthily rageful. That if a person, for example, sees some unethical behavior, sees some brutality, sees cruelty to animals, cruelty to other people, is receiving it, when a person observes such brutality, immorality, unethical behavior, then the healthy anger would comprise a kind of adrenaline-fueled no in the brain, according to what is ethical, immoral, moral, and so forth. Now, it is healthy when the person experiences that sensation and the no, but is in charge of their behavior and is able to review their thinking. And so if I see, heaven forbid, someone being cruel to a child, and I feel that rush, and this has happened to me, by the way. When I say cruel, a particular, it's not necessarily cruel, but negligence. A nanny walking a child, and it's hot sun on the child, and she's on her cell phone to her girlfriend, and I feel the child is being neglected. And what I think is healthy anger comes up. Now, I don't yell at the woman. I don't hit her in the face. I'm not a violent person. I even rescue insects, so I don't like to do any physical or other harm. Anyway, I feel that sensation of, wow, you know, that young child could get sunburn, and that would be harmful. And the woman is acting in a very negligent way. And then I assess what might be the best possible thing to do, if any, to correct this, what I view as an unethical situation. And so I might consider, is it best to gently, calmly say something to the woman? Or might that make her, stimulate her to make herself angry and the child ends up suffering? Do I see if I can contact someone else who might handle it in a diplomatic way? You know, if it were real abuse, I wouldn't hesitate to call 911. So in other words, I could go on, but I'm able to choose my action or inaction. So that to me is healthy anger. If I was simply concerned, that's better than being complacent and apathetic. But I think that place of and you used the word passion before, and I like that, you know, but there can also be crimes of passion. So we better temper it with rational thinking. Anyway, I'll give you a chance to reply, but I hope I've been somewhat clear in my understanding, definition, and application of the term of healthy, unhealthy.
Yes, I think you've been very clear. And I think what's happening here, Debbie, is I don't disagree with your view of dealing with cruelty, brutality, and things like that. The only thing that I see differently is what we label it. So we're dealing in the same universe in terms of behavior and how we act, things like that. But your call, it just seems to me, you're calling, if we were to put our reaction to, say, brutality on a scale in intensity from 0 to 100%, then it sounds like you're saying that intensity of 90% or higher, or 80% or higher, or 95% or higher, is you're calling that healthy anger. No.
Well, I don't see healthy anger to rage as elements of the same spectrum. I actually
No, I wasn't calling the spectrum a healthy anger spectrum. I was calling it an intensity spectrum.
Okay.
The intensity of your emotion.
Okay.
And or we could put we could have a similar scale with whether or not you're choosing your actions reasonably, or you're flying off the handle. So it seems to me you're putting the stronger reactions and stronger emotions under unhealthy anger, and the less strong under unhealthy, and the less strong under unhealthy anger. Is that right?
No, because one can feel passionately against seeing such brutal behavior, but still use one's rational thinking to choose one's behavior.
Oh, okay.
With the unhealthy, there is no or very little monitoring or choice apparent. The intensity might be the same, but there's an absence of mindfulness and objectivity.
Right. So, but I still think we're dealing with definitions, and if we're talking about the same thing, we're just using different words, and I think our disagreement is what REBT would say about these labels. And in order to support my view, I give you Albert Ellis, How to Live with and Without Anger. And in that book, on page 27, he says, anger stems from your irrational and illogical belief that a person's action equals the same thing as the person himself. And by the way, the title of this chapter is called The Insanity of Anger. So he's not talking about the insanity of unhealthy anger, but he's lumping all anger into the same category of insanity. So
I think that's an unfortunate title for the chapter.
Yeah, I know. Okay. Well, I think
he might agree even. Maybe the publisher put that in. I don't know.
Okay. Well, I think we expressed our opinions about this. Shall we go on to another topic, or did you want to discuss more about this?
I'll let you guide our conversation in the time that we have, Michael?
Okay,
How would you
I'll take that lead.
conclude our discussion on anger? Like, what would be your nutshell of what you and I said? And is there any common
Good
ground?
question. Good question. My nutshell would be that we're trying to help our clients get over disturbed emotions, whatever we call the disturbed emotions. And so we call these emotions, we have slightly different labels for the emotions. I think that when we define what we mean, it would be clear to anyone what we're talking about by our own labels. So that would be my conclusion.
Okay.
Okay.
Sure.
Okay, very good. So the next one is awful. And I think it sort of falls in the same category as what we were discussing, that we're really talking about the same thing. What we differ on is the best labels to use, and perhaps what Dr. Ellis would have used. So did I define anger first? So do you want to give your definition of awful first, and then I'll give mine?
Sure. Well, I'm going to quote what I remember Al used to say a lot, because in his final years, he and I co-led workshops and groups. And so I possibly could find this in some book. I haven't looked in books for quotes prior to our conversation for the purpose of this, but I very clearly remember that Al would often define awful. In fact, I was just showing a group of people that I was teaching a few weeks ago a video where Al says this. Awful, according to REBT, means as bad as it possibly could be. And Al used to say, following that, if you're alive, as bad as it is, and he would say, and some things are very, very bad, but if you're alive, it could always be worse. So the definition he used to give was totally as bad as it could be.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, I have a different definition from Al, since we're quoting the master, and this is in how to stubbornly refuse to make yourself miserable about anything, yes, anything. A very, very passionate, emotive title. And in his chapter on the tyranny of the shoulds, he says, when you call failure and rejection awful and horrible, you view them as more than bad or 100% inconvenient, which of course they cannot be. They aren't even 100% bad because they could even be worse.
I think we just agreed on definitions.
Well, you said, and I might have misunderstood, but you said awful is as bad as it could possibly be, and he's saying awful is worse than it could possibly be. It's out of reality. It's a fiction. It's 101% bad.
Oh, did he say 101%? I thought he said 100%.
No. When you call failure and rejection awful and horrible, you view them as more than bad or 101% inconvenient, which of course they cannot be. They aren't even 100% bad because they could even be worse. So what he's saying is that 100% bad is theoretically not even in reality, because no matter how bad it is, it could always be worse. An example he gives is that if you're being tortured to death for a month, it could be worse. You could be tortured to death for 2 months. So even that isn't awful because it's theoretically in reality. It's not even in reality, but 101% bad is what he's calling awful, clearly out of reality. It's a magical, fictional idea. And one of the things I tell clients to understand the basis of REBT is that it's fictions that make you disturbed. just like Santa Claus. Santa Claus is a fiction. There's no evidence for it. Must, shoulds, awfuls, terribles are fictions. There's no evidence for it. So if it's 101% bad, that's a fiction and leads to emotional disturbance.
Yeah. Well, again, I don't think we're disagreeing. I think the definition that I shared, that I heard him say many times, left out the 101% bit, but it did include the 100% as bad as it possibly could be. And if you're alive, it could always be worse. So I actually think we agree, Michael Edelstein.
Okay, so you're saying that awful means more than very bad?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, good. So I guess we agree. But not just as bad as it can be, but more than 100% bad, which it can't be.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. 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 I guess we have time for one more, and this is maybe pushing it a little in terms of trying to find a disagreement, but it's in terms of gratitude. And one of the things I recommend to clients and others about your writing and about your version of REBT is it gives it a big dose of gratitude. You add gratitude, which I think is very useful, and it's one of the mainstays of Martin Seligman's positive psychology, because he's found it very useful and probably done some research on it. So I think it's a great idea. But I think of REBT in two different categories. One is narrow REBT, where you just look at shoulds and musts, irrational beliefs, disputing them, acting against them, doing imagery to act against them and to uproot them. So that's what I call narrow REBT. I think Al called it in an article preferential REBT. And then there's more comprehensive or broader REBT, which you include many other strategies, techniques, concepts, and tools to help your clients. And so I think maybe what you're saying, or maybe where we agree, is gratitude is part of more comprehensive REBT, but it's not part of the more narrow kind of REBT. Is that right?
Yeah, it is part of the more comprehensive, but the more narrow with the ABC, actually the element of gratitude could be included post-disputation in the effective new philosophy.
Oh, sure, absolutely.
It could sneak in there.
Right, right. And I think that's a good point, because when I teach my clients the exercise, which I call the 3-minute exercise, or the ABCs, at E, I say, the more you write at E about why the must is false, the more you elaborate, that's meaningful, the more persuasive it tends to be. And certainly in an anger 3-minute exercise, for example, where you're at B, you're blaming the other person, hating the other person. And then at E, you say, I can be grateful to this person for these reasons. That is a good E. So I certainly agree with you there.
Mm-hmm. And sometimes if the person that you just referred to as ungrateful for them, if that person has committed some dastardly deeds, perhaps it wouldn't ring true at that early stage for the person to say, well, I'm grateful for this, that, or the other about them. But they could focus on being grateful for how this uncomfortable experience can contribute to them in a positive way. And also, additionally, though it may be inelegant, but so what if it helps, to think of other things people we're grateful for. So that's not dealing directly with the should and the must, which is the elegant approach in REBT. But inelegant sometimes is supplementary and helpful too.
Yeah, yeah, I totally agree. Well said. And then the final one was you had called REBT sexy.
Was that me or you, Michael?
One of us then. Again, so I think there's a narrower and broader issue here. The narrower meaning of sexy, I think, is sexually attractive. So I can say when I think of REBT, I find it sexually arousing. So not in
I'm
that
kind
sense.
of glad to hear that, Michael.
Yes.
I'd be worried for your
Right.
clients.
But in the more comprehensive meaning that it's exciting and appealing, that kind of thing. I think if that's what we mean by sexy, we can agree that REBT is sexy. And is that the way you meant it?
If in fact it was me who initiated it, yeah, probably, yes. And it may have been indeed. Or we were joking and it came up and I said, but
Right.
it is, because it
Right.
is. So what do I mean? No, not arousing, God. But well, and another angle, you know, when you're considering the word sexy, it's of life force, it's of vitality, it's proactive, it's of life, to life, for life. It's intense, it's passionate, it's often connected with or fueled by love. And not to sound overly romantic, idealistic, or corny, REBT at its core comes, I believe, from Al's love of the potential of human beings to not create unnecessary suffering. So to me, REBT is imbued with love. So there's love, there's passion, there's intensity, there's humor. I find humor sexy. So yeah, taking away that very non-appropriate connection with sexy equals arousing. No, no, no. But sexy, yeah, appealing, attractive, vigorous, life force, loving, 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 happy, joyful. Yeah, I could go on.
Great, great, great. Yeah, yeah. And I think you just demonstrated to our viewers how you add this another dimension to REBT, the emotive and passionate dimension and loving dimension that some of us who are more restricted aren't good at adding. So thanks for that, Debbie. And thank you for joining us. I think that we clarified some issues here and ended on an agreement, which is always nice. So, and thank you, viewers, for watching. Please give us a like. We're the REBT advocates, plus Debbie Jaffe Ellis, minus Tommy Bateman tonight. And subscribe to the REBT advocates to stay on the rational side of life.